Thanks, everyone. My name is Jeff Weiss. I am the chair of ASTM Committee F49 on Digital Information in the Supply Chain. Really appreciate the opportunity to chat with everyone today. I wanted to talk about a traceability standard for rare earth elements that we're in the beginning stages of developing in the F49 Committee. Today, I wanted to first walk through some background on ASTM. You can go to the next slide. Great, thanks. I'm going to talk through some background on ASTM, talk a bit about the Committee on Digital Information in the Supply Chain, which I chair. It's also known as the F49 Committee. Walk through the basics of our standard guide for supply chain traceability. There are 4 pillars to that approach. And then we'll talk about how we're going to apply that standard guide to critical minerals, specifically rare earth elements. Next slide, please. Thank you. ASTM has been around since 1898. It's recognized by the OECD as a developer of international standards. I believe the first standard developed related to railroad ties. There are over 150 committees, 30,000 volunteer standards developers working directly to develop standards in those committees. ASTM standards have been incorporated by reference in laws and regulations around the world more than 8,000 times. ASTM is a neutral technical forum which maintains procedures to ensure an open, transparent, consensus-based process, a balance of interest, and impartiality. And we also seek to resolve all substantive comments. ASTM, in my experience, can develop standards much faster than other standards bodies, especially where there's a strong market and governmental need. And in this particular area, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, we think that there is a strong need. The fees vary for participating, but the annual fee for an individual to join is $115 per year. All meetings of our committee are either virtual or hybrid. We have 2 in-person meetings a year that are hybrid. Next, please. In terms of our standards development process, we first ask whether it's ripe to develop a standard. Is there a government and/or market need for a standard? Are there any existing standards out there? We always try to work with existing standards to not duplicate work or create inconsistencies, and we'll talk a bit about that later on. And do we have stakeholders that are committed to participate in the process? If there is a need, we've checked all those boxes, then we would form a committee. If there isn't a committee that develops standards in that area, a subcommittee, if there is an existing committee and we want to create a new line of work, or a task group in an existing subcommittee to develop the specific standard. Once we get subcommittee approval to proceed with developing a new standard, the task group develops a first draft. Typically, that's led by the proponents of the standard. They should help drive that activity and provide their technical expertise. And then the draft standard has to go through 2 rounds of balloting, first in the relevant subcommittee and then in the full committee. There are many permutations of this. Sometimes things can go through multiple ballots, concurrent ballots. There are different thresholds at different levels, and technical comments are addressed throughout the process. We like technical comments. Those improve the standard, and we want to make sure that if we're developing standards, they're actually going to be used in the real world. So we pride ourselves on accepting as many technical comments in our standards as possible. Next slide, please. So the scope of the F49 committee is laid out in this slide. It includes developing standards and specifications, definitional and terminological standards, and practices and guides relating to the sharing and use of digital information in the supply chain. So we're not going to say for example, what the ESG standard is, but we're going to stay in our lane, which is how do you share and use that digital information in the supply chain. So it's across industry sectors. We coordinate with other committees. For example, we're coordinating right now with the F38 committee at ASTM, which is the drone committee. So we're working with them on a traceability standard for drones. We also want to coordinate with other SDOs, and you'll see from later on that we do that extensively. And we want to ensure that standards are technology and vendor neutral, and of course, consistent with WTO principles. Next slide, please. So we've developed 6 international standards so far relating to digital information in the supply chain. As you can see, 5 of the standards relate to goods movement. The committee was originally formed during COVID in response to all the supply chain disruption issues that we had. And so we have a very robust amount of work going on the movement of goods, particularly when it comes to terminology and helping stakeholders work better together in the supply chain. And then we've also developed in a subcommittee on traceability that I chair, a standard guide for supply chain traceability, authentication, verification, and validation, and oversight. And that is based on the use of emerging technologies, including blockchain. I know that's a handful. We're seeking to simplify that actually in the next revision of the standard, but that lays out the main pillars, which I'm going to describe in a few minutes. Next slide. Here is a list of the 20 work items that are under development in the committee. There is quite a bit of work going on. Again, as you'll see, a lot of these standards relate to goods movement. So we tend to try to coordinate with the Surface Transportation Board and the Federal Maritime Commission on those, as well as the Office of Multimodal Freight at DOT. But then we also have a whole host of traceability standards that are based off the guide that I just mentioned in the previous slide that are sector specific. So we're working on a sector specific traceability standard for textiles, for medical gloves, for drones, as I mentioned before, fresh cargo, and then as you can see at the bottom in highlight, a guide for verification of a conformity assessment supporting rare earth elements, which I'll discuss later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. And as I said before, we strive to work in conjunction with other standards bodies and make sure that we're following the TBT principle of coherence and making sure that we use existing standards wherever possible rather than reinventing the wheel. And so here is an illustrative list of some of the ISO standards and ISO IEC standards that we are using in our standards in F49. That includes standards relating to cybersecurity, chain of custody, as well as conformity assessment. And there's a pretty substantial conformity assessment component in our supply chain traceability standards. Next slide, please. Current membership, we have 94 members, although we have several others that we actually need to approve. My staff manager is on the call here, and so she's going to be bugging me after the call because I need to make sure we approve them. So we're going to be over 100 shortly. The members are currently split between producer, user, and general interest. I would say most of the people involved are in the supply chain space, XCBP, track and trace platforms, authentication of supply chain items and documents, digital identification of either supply chain actors or events or both, analytics providers, as well as experts in trade policy and forced labor and other regulatory compliance issues. We also have representatives that are driving some of the specific work items for sector-specific traceability. So fresh produce, personal protective equipment, solar semiconductors, rubber, coffee, defense, forest products, chemicals. We also have members from government agencies, conformity assessment and accreditation bodies, and academic experts on supply chain issues. And our members participate actively in digital supply chain related work in ISO, Global Blockchain Business Council, the Intermodal Association of North America, GS1, and UNCFAC. So we want to always make sure we know what's going on in those other fora so we can use what's out there and coordinate where possible. And I believe we're working on a liaison agreement with the Intelligent Transportation Committee in ISO as we speak. Next slide, please. So in terms of why we're pushing traceability standards, the drivers behind traceability on the government side have never been more intense for a whole host of reasons. And I've listed a couple of examples here that are pretty recent. So one note here is from the recent G7 trade ministers communique from May. The ministers talked about the need to include standards-based approaches and transparency and traceability mechanisms to help ensure supply chain resilience and diversification in a coordinated manner. So this is sector neutral. This is in the trade space across all sectors. So governments are pushing this. In the US context, I wanted to note a recent executive order that was issued by the president a few weeks ago on strengthening customs enforcement. And this executive order is pushing Homeland Security and US Customs to prevent trade fraud and increase tariff collection. I saw a recent estimate finding that the US government was losing out on $40 billion a year of tariff revenue due to illegal transshipment and other types of trade crime. So that is a huge driver for governments. So you have supply chain resilience and diversification, you have revenue collection. Those are things that are pushing traceability. And then you also have supply chain security, particularly in the critical mineral supply chain space. So I would just point to the G7 Leaders Declaration on securing supply chains for critical minerals from a few weeks ago that recognizes the importance of strong transparency and traceability frameworks to ensure supply chain security. There's some interesting language at the bottom about working towards establishing harmonized, interoperable mechanisms aligned with our interests that ensure traceability and transparency regarding the origin of critical minerals. I used to be a G7 negotiator. I can imagine that what they were pushing for was a reference to international standards, but there was likely one member wanting to hedge on that and insist on language about mechanisms that align with our interests. But I think we know they're talking about standards there. Next slide, please. So when we write the rare earth traceability standard, we're going to be basing it on the ASTM standard guide for supply chain traceability. And again, this is sector neutral, and this lays out the approach, a menu of options that a regulator would take in developing a traceability regime. And we've drafted it to be technology neutral and vendor neutral, and we've included elements on track and trace, authentication, validation, verification, and oversight. The guide is jurisdiction agnostic and agency agnostic. So it could be used to validate claims relating to a whole host of issues. The ones we see most often are origin, ownership, forced labor, domestic content, prevention of counterfeit, enforcement of specific trade measures, sustainability. And that could be done by a whole host of different governmental authorities. It could include trade and customs authorities, tax authorities, procurement authorities, or others. And as I mentioned before, the supplementary traceability standards we're developing include rare earth elements and several others that appeared on the preceding slide, and we could operationalize this for other products and other use cases. And again, we stick to traceability. We don't get into what the requirements ought to be. So for a carbon footprint standard, we wouldn't say in our committee, since we lack the expertise to do that, this is what the carbon footprint standard should be. We would rather draft, if there was governmental or market desire to do so, we would draft how you would actually validate a claim that that particular standard has been met using digital tools. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 pillars of our supply chain traceability approach. Again, this is a menu of options, and the way the menu would be applied would depend on what is the risk of noncompliance, what's the level of confidence that the regulator or other agency needs to comply with requirements. So this is based on longstanding U.S. government law and policy on conformity assessment. Track and trace, logging the movement of goods and documents at every step in the supply chain, every node from beginning to end, authenticating the documentation and the data points to verify the origin and legitimacy of them, validating the claims relating to those documents, looking at the shipment by shipment data, but also systemic data, so using analytics in determining whether to validate or not those claims. And we would be developing red flags consistent with those specific supply chains. And then the oversight mechanism that the agency would use to review, monitor, and enforce compliance, either on its own or through a third party. Next slide, please. So going into a little more detail, step 1 is track and trace. Essentially, in this approach, we lay out how you could record events as they occur and link them through unique identifiers to maintain a continuous verifiable record. A key part of this is making sure that business confidential information is protected. That seems to be a key issue in every supply chain that inhibits this type of work, and making sure we get that right is really important. This system would allow regulators or recognized third parties that are working on behalf of the regulators to review events, identify are there risks, are there anomalies that need to be flagged, and then sending forward summarized or detailed data as the regulator needs to support oversight and enforcement. So this would create more of a compliance framework versus what we have now, which is more of an enforcement framework. You're good unless we audit you. This type of system would support more shipment by shipment compliance. Next slide, please. Step 2 is authentication. What you see here, and this is very small, I apologize, but this is an example of a certification of authenticity for polysilicon. And again, we provide an explanation in the standard of how to do this with digital ledger technology, but this could be done with any type of tamper evident means to ensure that the data and the documents are what they say they are. The idea is that the relevant data points would be consolidated into a COA, which would be digitally linked to the physical shipment via a QR code. And that would allow an agency to have real-time verification at the product, pallet, or container level, depending on what they need. This would be uploaded into the traceability platform under step 1, and it will be available for audit by a recognized third party or the government, again, as the agency sees fit in designing their scheme. Next slide, please. So now you have your single source of truth. You have the elements uploaded into the traceability platform. And again, this could be a permission link so the data stays on your system. You have the data authenticated. The next layer is validation. So checking that a specific claim for a specific shipment is accurate. And again, this is claim agnostic in the guide. We go into this in more detail in the sector specific standards, but this could include, for example, an importer claiming that tariffs shouldn't apply to this particular product, or a manufacturer that wants to substantiate a claim that this is made in X jurisdiction or made with or not made with this material, or a company verifying eligibility for tax credits tied to a domestic content threshold. Those are just some examples. The idea behind this is that you're basing validation on ISO IEC 17029 as supplemented by an agency. There is a standard for how this is done, and it's based on objective evidence and independent evaluation so that an agency can rely on those claims with confidence and legal defensibility, the way that agencies rely on third parties in many other schemes. And analysis is conducted not just at the claim level, but also at the systemic level, again, as needed by the regulator, depending on the risk and the level of confidence that they need. I do a lot of forced labor compliance work. Looking at paper documents is just not sufficient, even if it looks like the shipments match up, without getting a broader view of the supply chain, how much is being sold to whom, how much is crossing borders. Can you understand, does this transaction actually make sense? Could this transaction have actually occurred? Does this quantity of this equal that quantity of that? That's the kind of thing that having a systemic pattern-based analysis, which can be done very, very quickly, can really help with shipment by shipment traceability. There's also the option, again, based on the risk tolerance, for third-party audits to ensure that systems are in place to produce valid claims on a shipment-specific basis. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the analytics step, the analytics portion of step 3. If you were to use analytics, this is a analytics, a risk score. This was actually developed by a company called Natelix, which is in our committee, and runs the predict system for FDA. So they generate a risk score for every FDA regulated import. And so they are prepared to do this to implement F49 and generate a risk score for any shipment that we're trying to validate a claim. And this is an example of what this looks like uploaded to customs website, the automated commercial environment. This could be uploaded to a CMS website for a domestic content requirement for PPE, or for DoD looking to validate a procurement preference for Made in America, for instance. So this could be used in a lot of different contexts. There are other technologies that could be used. If you're looking to show that a particular parcel of land remains deforested over time, then you would want to work in satellite data to show continuous compliance. So there are a lot of different tools that we lay out as examples that can be used as part of the validation step, again, depending on the sector, the risk, the level of confidence. Next slide, please. The fourth pillar we wanted to make sure that we emphasized is oversight. Nothing that we put in the standard changes the fact that the relevant agency retains full authority over compliance decisions, admissibility decisions, enforcement decisions. All of these tools, these digital tools, these third-party tools would not replace that authority, but improve agency effectiveness through the use of, again, private sector conformity assessment, consistent with longstanding U.S. law and policy, and state-of-the-art technology. And all this could be done without governments having to hire more people or purchase additional hardware or software, which is going to be obsolete as soon as they do that. All of this can be adopted as the technology changes, and then the scheme could be crafted so that it would convey the relevant information to the agency in any form it wants. Next slide. Thanks. So we're now turning to developing a draft standard guide for verifying a conformity assessment with respect to rare earth elements and derivative products. So we're going to adapt the four-pillar approach that I just laid out to rare earth elements. This activity was suggested to us by USTR. So that is why we have decided to undertake this work. It was suggested that we add this to our plate last year. This was before USTR launched its effort to potentially negotiate an agreement on trade in critical minerals. Now it makes sense. I did not know that was coming. And so we are trying to move as quickly as possible with the assumption that potentially this could become part of an enforcement mechanism under that agreement. I have no independent confirmation of that. I'm just reading between the lines. But we are happy to have input into this standard. Again, governments are pushing this. I think using a standards-based approach in a plurilateral context, like an agreement on trade in critical minerals, allows actors from different jurisdictions, including government agencies, to participate, to work together to develop a standard that works for everyone, rather than having an approach dictated in a negotiated text. So I think that this approach could be very helpful in that context as well as others. Our metrics for this standard, as well as the other standards we're developing, is we want the standard to be administratively as simple as possible, cost effective and accurate, allow for shipment by shipment validation of relevant claims. And again, those claims could be origin claims. They could be forced labor claims. It really depends on what the regulators want or what they're looking for for example, in the ATCM, and protect business confidential information. Some of the questions that we're asking in this context, and again, we are happy to have participation from different actors in the rare earth supply chain, rare earth producers who we're talking to, as well as producers of products that utilize rare earth elements in them. What are the commercial and transportation data points that we would need to create a digital twin covering every node of the supply chain from mine to the final manufactured product? We've already done this for polysilicon. Silicon is listed on the USGS critical minerals list, so we have a pretty good idea of how this would work. But I think one question we have is whether that approach will work for all critical minerals, for all rare earth elements, or whether there need to be bespoke approaches to different elements. I expect it's going to be a little of both, that there are going to be some things that apply across the board and some things that are going to be sector specific. What are the pain points that we need to address? So for example, on the polysilicon side, one of the issues is commingling at the silicon metal stage as well as the polysilicon stage. And if you have commingling of different inputs, then the documentation that's being submitted down the supply chain could be inaccurate in terms of the origin of that material and whether the material is forced labor free or not. What are some of the other pain points? Are there chemical tests that can be done to distinguish origin? There are tests that work in the textile and apparel sector. In other sectors, that doesn't work. I have seen in the nitrile glove sector that is possible. Technology is changing all the time, and so it's going to be interesting to see how we integrate that into the standards going forward. And again, we welcome collaboration with existing schemes in rare earth and critical minerals to help build out or enhance the traceability component of their schemes. Again, we're not going to get into what the worker protections need to be, what the sustainability requirements need to be. We're going to focus on our lane, which is how do we validate claims in the supply chain using digital tools and recognized third parties. Next slide. And this is the last slide, and I just wanted to point out that we actually do have a bit of a time crunch. This is language from House Appropriations Homeland Security Committee that was issued just a few weeks ago. And House Appropriations is recommending that U.S. Customs engage with a privately funded supply chain traceability platform based on relevant international standards such as ASTM supply chain traceability standards to do shipment by shipment track and trace for a whole host of sectors, including rare earth elements and a few other sectors that I mentioned. And then we're assuming that if all goes according to a plan, assuming we actually have an appropriations bill that passes the Senate and it's reconciled, that this would pass in December. And then there's a 180-day period after which CBP needs to report back to the House on how they intend to implement this across their import operations. So we do actually have some time pressure in order to get this done on the rare earth side, and very interested in working with folks on the line here and others in this endeavor. Again, I'm the standards person. I am not the rare earth or nitrile glove or UAS person. We need technical experts in all those areas to help us write the sector-specific standards. We have many of them, but we could always use more experts. So why don't I end it there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks so much for taking the time.